Welcome, everybody. We're here for the webinar presented by BEST, and some of our panelists are from across our wonderful United States. And the focus of today's panel is why we chose BEST. So I just want to welcome and note that today we're going to be answering questions, and these might be about test administration, placement, teacher and student feedback, reporting, and then any questions around new products and development, things like that. But really, this is just an information sharing time for folks like you to represent why you were able to come to the decision you did about what assessment you use, so that you can help folks who are newer to that process kind of gel it in their minds. All right. Just a little bit of grounding. Everybody's pretty accustomed to this, but just pointing out where some features are on Zoom, just in case. If you're not a panelist, if you will, keep your camera off and your mic's muted, unless you're speaking and engaging. That'll help with bandwidth issues if your internet's spotty. And please make avid use of the chat. And so the purpose of today is to hear from the field, from people like you, about how they use our products, Best Literacy and Best Plus 2.0, in your context to kind of make it real. To just ground it a little bit, we'll have some participation norms. I like to use the chat box as sort of a question parking lot. We're not going to use polls today. I forgot I left that in, but if it seems appropriate, we might do a breakout. But definitely explore the features of Zoom if you want to raise hands or use any of the little emoji type reactions. And, feel free to share what's helped you adjust to the digital space that helps for your participation, things that you like about engaging in an online space. I'll give a moment for that, and then up next, we'll introduce our panelists. So I invite folks to either come off mute or post in the chat things that have helped them in online learning situations or sharing situations, webinar situations. All right, one of my norms is let it get weird. Sometimes you just got to take time when you're online. So you take those awkward pauses to make sure, has the internet loaded? Have our thoughts loaded? Are we ready? All right, thank you all. But feel free to pop in other norms as they come to you in the chat, and we'll call them out and uplift them. And now I'd love to introduce our wonderful panelists. Ooh, I see a couple comments. I love this. Collaboration, making sure you have good connections. Yeah, understanding that everyone is learning right now, so we can make mistakes. Yes, please. Yes, please. Thank you. Keep them coming. Thank you, Chelsea, Gavin, and Karen. All right, so I would love to introduce our panelists. So we'll do it popcorn style. I will start with who I am, just because I happen to be the voice from the void speaking to you now. My name is Katie. I use they, them pronouns. I represent Best Client Relations. I'm here in Washington, D.C. And so I use all the best products, but I actually started as a user in 2006 when I was an AmeriCorps volunteer at a literacy council in Northern Virginia. And so we were using them to help place our classroom students in the right level and to be able to couch that with teacher feedback, because we were predominantly using the Best Plus at that time. But I will pop it over to Jacqueline.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline Ellis. I work for Catholic Charities of Santa Rosa, which is in California. And we use Best Plus 2.0, and we started last fall.
Would you like to pop it to someone?
Oh, yes. Selena, I would like to pop it to you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. My name is Selena Josephs, and I work at 32BJ Training Fund, which is a training fund for the 32BJ union, the building union, building workers union, sorry. And I'm in New York City, and we use Best Plus 2.0, and I believe we started using them since 2008. I'm not 100% sure. This was before my time. So I think it's around then. All right, nice to meet you all.
So welcome Elizabeth to the floor.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Schroeder, and I work with Jefferson County Public Schools Adult Education. Karen Canoe is also here. She's the program coordinator, and I'm the instructional lead, and I work with the refugees. We are in Denver, Colorado, and we use the Best Plus 2.0, and we just started using this, like Jacqueline, last fall, and December, I think, was our live date.
Thank y'all so much. So we were looking to invite folks who had a smattering of experience. Either they have just started using it, or they're using it in a state that's sort of unexpected, or they're using it in an interesting context. So there are community-based literacy organizations on the call. There are folks working with unions, folks working with refugees. So I think it's useful to kind of be able to think like, how are folks using this and what works for their situation to help you make decisions about what would be similar or different for your program. I do want to give a little shout out. Are there any best literacy users on the call? Just if you'll either pop it in the chat or raise your hand. It's just interesting to know. I had a feeling we would mostly focus on Best Plus, but we can talk about both. Open to any, either, all. And this question goes to our participants, not just panelists. So I see a raised hand from Christina Indovina. Great. All right. So let's get into it. And let's start talking some questions. So we can popcorn again. And we can go one question at a time. We don't have to have one person answer all these questions, but thinking about that context, focuses of your classes, and how you use the product will be helpful. For instance, I'll just give a little bit of grounding. At the Literacy Council, where I used to work, we used to make the Best Plus part of our intake process. So that would be when we're doing our pre-test. And then after 60 hours of instruction, we would do pull out of each student for their testing while the class sessions were happening. At the time that they reached 60 hours. So other programs may do different things. That class met twice a week for 2 hours each. But you all might have different contexts as far as what demographics you're working with or the intensity of your classes. So you get to choose which question you want to answer, and I'll pop it over to Selena.
Okay, so a lot of the people in our program, they come from all different kinds of educational backgrounds, also different literacy levels too. And our courses I mostly focus on speaking and listening, but we do offer like a full package, like with writing and also reading, but with emphasis on speaking and listening. Our courses usually meet once or twice a week for about 4 hours total a week. And this is we have 3 trimesters, which is about, I'm trying to think, like 4 months, more or less. And we use BEST for placement. For intake placement, also same as what Katie was saying, we pull students out after every 100+ hours of instruction to see where they're at and to see if they need to be moved to a different level or different course. Should I just keep going with the questions, or no? We said one question at a time, right?
It's up to you. It's up to you. And we can also popcorn if somebody has a different experience. That might be a nice contrast. How about Jacqueline? What's it like for your program? How the intensity or demographics or anything like that?
Well, I teach a citizenship class, and so, well, the reason we use Best Plus is because when the classes went online, we needed a way to test the students, to pre and post test students remotely. And Best Plus was the only test that's available that our funders accepted where students can use their cell phone. So I'm in California, which is known as a CASAS state. They're all, everything is really centered around CASAS, and that's what we used to use. But the paper-based CASAS test, for obvious reasons, wasn't going to happen, especially in California, which was completely shut down for a long time. And our grant funders were very clear that we still needed to test, even though there was, the pandemic, which everybody went through, shut down and all that. So I found Best Plus, which I was very grateful for, that we could actually use, students could just use their cell phones. CASAS does have a remote testing ability, but there's a huge hurdle that we're a very small agency and we were just not able to meet. So we find it very easy to use. So, and we could use it, if the students just use their cell phones, and it has worked really, really well. So we use it only as a pre-test and a post-test, mainly for the grant funders, but it's also, of course, helpful for me to know what the level of what the student level is. So it's helpful for that reason too.
Elizabeth, do you want to share how it's worked out for your agency so far?
Sure. So our program, our primary program is AFLA funded, and we run all levels of instruction. So NRS 1 to 6 for ESL, and we're opening up ABE and ASE again in this coming year. And we decided to do Best Plus. One, it was expedited because of the pandemic, of course, and just like Jacqueline said, we needed something that we could do pre and post. Most importantly, intakes for pre-test. So it was very timely that it was coming about too, but we had been using CASAS as our primary assessment and placement tool. What we really found out though, the teachers were struggling a little bit with the placement on CASAS because it's just not comprehensive enough. And so, Selena, I think you were talking a little bit about the different background levels or the educational levels as well. And I think that plays a huge part in how you go about working with students and building that full, the well-rounded classroom experience for them with reading, writing, speaking, listening. And with only the CASAS, it was helping us with, vocabulary and such, but it really was not getting to the core of comprehension and production, oral production. So bringing in Best Plus for a complement to CASAS for placement, as well as progress, really helped. We implemented it in December, and that round of students only got the Best Plus until we were able to bring them in around February, March for the CASAS. And we started to see some discrepancies. And just as we had the other way around, where they had a higher level speaking and a lower level reading score, and that would probably have changed where we would have placed them. So now looking at that, we're doing an analysis, looking at both scores as we're working with placement, and we've pretty much decided we're going to place them in the lower score, just like we would if we were doing a tape and we ever had reading and math. You place them in the lower score level. So our classes are pretty intensive. We run 8 to 10 hours a week, as is the requirement in Colorado. And they're saying that we have to post tests after 40 hours. We're going to amend that next year and say 60, because there's no way, if a student has great attendance, we're testing, every 5 to 6 weeks, and that is not effective and not helpful to the student or any of us. So we are looking at changing that. We don't have a lot of outcomes to report on yet, but we will next year.
Go ahead, Jacqueline. I see your hand raised.
Oh, yes. So I just wanted to follow up on what Elizabeth said. So we used to use the CASAS reading test as pre and post, and then we shifted to Best Plus 2.0, and we saw a big difference in learning gains because the citizenship test really focuses more on conversation, which is what the Best Plus tests, rather than reading comprehension, which is what the citizenship test or citizenship class is not focused on reading comprehension. So that really helped us with our post-test gains, which is something that the funders pay attention to a lot. So that helped us in addition. That's all.
Yeah, that's great context, Jacqueline and Elizabeth. Thank you. And one thing we say as the test publisher is that different assessments are built for different purposes. So our focus is for the Best Plus is really the speaking and listening. And so sometimes the comparisons, even though they work with the same NRS levels, you do have to have that sort of more full spectrum. Like how would you couch it with teacher feedback or the other tools you might use for your placement or diagnostics to make sure that you're leveling them in a way that makes sense programmatically. Great. I did have one question that was emailed in, and I'm just going to look at it before I say it. Sometimes you have to read a thing before you say it. There are 3 questions, actually. How do you account for high vocabulary but simple sentence structure? So that sounds like a scoring question. I'm happy to pitch it over to Selena. Selena is also a fellow trainer.
Hi, I just wanted to add one more thing, actually, before we move on.
Yeah, please.
One thing about our demographics, too, is that because they don't have the same educational history, a lot of people don't know how to take tests. So a lot of test taking is a skill in itself, and a lot of students just perform poorly. So having something that's kind of like a conversation, something that people, feel a little bit more comfortable with, it just seemed easier for, just kind of like to level the playing field a little bit, making it a little bit more equitable for everybody. So that's one thing I wanted to mention.
And I would concur with that, Selena. We had devised an oral interview with the refugees before we adopted BEST. And it helped, but having this standardized is really great because we could use it for placement, but we couldn't use it for growth. The one we made up, but it's been really nice for that refugee population because it does seem more like a conversation. And the thing I'm really grateful for is the pictures, the photographs that we can put up there, because if students get stuck, then what are the words that you recognize? And so they can just spout those off so you can see if there's anything that they can produce where it doesn't feel so pressured. And they can say a couple of the words, like the one in the supermarket, and they can name off a couple of produce items, then they feel like they've accomplished something. And so that, I think, is starting from a really stronger base than the deficit that, taking the classes is going to provide for some students.
Yep.
Selena, before I pitch that question to you, it looks like Deborah Virgo came off mute. So I just want to check. Deborah, did you have a question?
No, I hit the wrong button. Sorry, guys.
Oh, but you're welcome to have a question if you like.
I do, because I was typing one. I wondered if anybody is mixing pre-test and post-test, either remote or in person or with a mask and without a mask, and if they're seeing odd results, not gains when you would expect a gain because of how we're doing the remote or in person. So, thanks.
Totally fair question for this time of transition. I have no idea, so I'm going to pitch it to the folks who are actively working with learners.
Well, I can talk a little bit about it. We haven't done really, Karen and I have done a couple of in-person with masks, and it was so hard. And I don't think I recommend it for that environment. The online we're using Zoom, and now the district has told us we can't. So we're using Google Meet, which actually is not a problem. And if they can get onto Google. But I find that so much better because you can just gauge so much of their comprehension, and you can tell if you need to change, to more casual conversation because their body language is just up close and personal with them, and just do that. But for the in person with masks, we just now this week have been allowed to be in buildings without masks. So we do have that capacity, but I don't think we're going to really start it. I think we're going to wait till classes are back in session in August, and we'll maintain the online component. And Karen, if you have anything to add to that, you can jump in, but I think this is a great environment to do this test.
Yeah, I'm curious to find out what will happen when we're doing it in person. I look forward to being able to do that and not have technology at all be any sort of a hindrance. It will be nice to try it and also not have masks in person be a hindrance. But I don't know when that day will actually come, because we don't know right now who of our students have been vaccinated and who has not been, and it's a sensitive issue that we have not been given directions on how to even approach that. So I'm very curious as to how that will be. I think it would be quite nice to be able to do it in person and not have a screen between us. One thing that is nice, though, about the screen is that it does, especially for our students who are used to being in a screen environment as far as instruction, is that I just think whatever environment your student is used to being in is going to be the environment where you'll get the best results. And so if your students are used to being in an in-person environment, then that would be the best way to test. But since right now all of our students are so used to being in a screen environment, that is where they're comfortable right now. And so I think that it will be interesting to see next year, because our plan is to have some classes in person and some classes online. So we'll let you know next year what happens. But I do think that however the student is used to having instruction will be the best way to provide the assessment. That's all I got.
One thing that I do find interesting, though, of the in-person testing, because we've done some in-person with masks on, these students usually go to classrooms with teachers wearing a mask. So in a way, kind of like levels it off a little bit, because they're taking, they have to take these courses or these lessons with a teacher who's wearing a mask. So when we place them in that level, so let's put it this way, in-person testing and an in-person class kind of ends up working out a little bit for us. But it is hard. It is really hard, because you lose so much information, from your lips and your facial expressions. I mean, I think that's most of spoken language is actually visual. So, but yeah, I 100% agree with Elizabeth that it's hard. Like, I've had to do testing myself, and just not being able to read people's lips, even for me to understand what people are saying, is hard.
Just a quick poll of the folks listening in. Well, context and then poll. So we're speaking about BEPS Plus, which has been approved to be administered virtually, meaning via video conference, much like you logging into this webinar. So instead of a group of people, it would just be one test administrator and one examinee, or in the case of my experience working with Selena, you'll be in a breakout room with a learner that gets pulled out of the class, something like that. All this to couch that if you're a regular BEPS Plus user who's been taking a break during the pandemic, some of these folks are describing virtual test administration, which is basically doing the test with video online. Just a poll of the folks who are on the call, and you can put it in the chat or come off mute, or use raise hand. Raise hand may be the most efficient if you have access to it and feel comfortable. If you have done virtual test administration. Yeah, and Penny asks the crowd if folks are able to wear a face shield as an option for in-person, I'm guessing. But it looks like most of you have had some experience with the the virtual test administration via video conferencing? Jocelyn notes yes, but very few done remotely. I'm guessing the yes is in response to the face shield. Is that right, Jocelyn? Okay. Well, thank you all. That's just useful to know. And I'm just going to lower everybody's hands and then ask a second question. Lower hand, lower hand, lower hand. So second question, it sounds like some of the presenters are thinking about continuing some amount of virtual classes and potentially virtual test administration. Let's pitch that question to the group. Now that the pandemic is subsiding some, or we'll see what happens, do you anticipate a mixture of in-person and online classes in your program's future? Yeah, and there's probably a large degree of I don't know, which is totally fair. Okay. Yeah, that's just useful for us to know as the test publisher so that we can be ready to support you. Great. Yeah, and it does sound like across these users speaking about their learners that there's something to context, where if you're in the context of doing virtual makes sense for testing. If you're in the context of in-person with masks, it'll be less acclimation if the class has already done that sort of acclimation. It's more of the, if you're making a choice purely for the sake of testing, that is sounding like a hurdle. Yeah, and speaking to Karen, uplifting how nice it would be to have the intimacy of in-person and no masks. Once we are in person, we'll have those other issues again with the things that affect attrition, like the commuting and the car troubles and the multiple jobs and all the demands of working families and people. So it'll be interesting to see how things change and resume or don't resume as far as this rub between people's priorities and abilities. All right, so I'll turn it back to this question about how do you account for high vocabulary but simple sentence structure? And I will assume this question comes to us from Jordy Woolridge of Literacy Services of Indian River County in Vero Beach. I'm assuming this question is in regards to Best Plus, but just to couch it a little bit for if this question was for Best Literacy has a pretty clear scoring guide in the Best Literacy Test Manual. And that goes over how to score sentences for any of the written portions. But I'll turn it over to Selena or any of our other trainers on the call to talk about how to account for high vocabulary but simple sentence structure for Best Plus scoring.
And I'm guessing that this is mostly for language complexity, right?
I would guess. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like I usually tend to lean more on structure. Like, how do you put these words together? Because if they're just saying words, then that's not really a very complex thing, even if the vocabulary is pretty good. So that's kind of my instinct, would be lean more on the actual sentence structure versus the words that are being used. I think once the language complexity gets kind of in the higher ranges, then I think it makes sense to take that into account. I think I don't have my sheet with me, but I believe that if it's language complexity for vocabulary, oh, you have it right there. Oh my God, I usually have it right in front of me, but oh, actually I do have one. Oh no, this is, yeah. Right, so I feel like vocabulary does play a little bit more of a role the higher you go, if they're using something. Right, okay, language complexity of 4, it says here, and I quote, vocabulary more precise. So I think I think that will be my answer. Depends on how complex the sentence is first, and then I'll factor the in the higher they go.
Yeah, I always say lean on your rubric.
Yeah. All right.
I just want to leave it open if other trainers, I see Dr. Mary Peterson and Danielle Peterson with a D as well. If you have other thoughts you prefer to share. Okay, cool. So another question from same user, Jordy Woolridge. Okay, I think this is a great question. So this is for a potentially new user, because I think Jordy has some folks signed up for our next training. How have you been able to correlate the Best Plus score to the materials you use? So I think this is a great getting started question. If you're just adding Best Plus into your repertoire, how you did your crosswalk to your class levels or your texts or things like that.
That's a great question, Katie, and I'm trying to remember. But I believe we use the Future series, the Pearson Future series, and there is a breakdown with Pearson on the different, I want to say, I don't remember if it was the SPL or the, I can't remember exactly, but we kind of mapped that down so that a lot of our, the syllabus kind of correlates to the Best Plus scores, and these scores correlate to this thing that it's kind of in progress right now, but we have these can-do statements. It's all connected. It's Best Plus, our material, the books that the students use, and the can-do statements that teachers kind of use to assess their students.
Yeah, I would love to uplift that. So of course, there are the NRS levels, and there are 6 of them, but 6 is kind of a really broad range. So there's also the student performance levels. And so that's the same range, but it's 10 levels. So just look at the descriptors for both. And I would say contextualize it in your program and think about how that might correlate to your folks. I do want to thank Jacqueline. She's got to hop off. Unfortunately, she has an emergency repair, and we're so thankful for the time you've been able to offer today.
Yes, well, thank you, everybody. Good luck. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Jacqueline. But the SPLs and the NRS are a good starting point. And then very often text publishers will look at those descriptors to crosswalk with their text. So if you're working with a major publisher's books, you'll probably find something similar in a table, either in the appendix or in early pages of the book to help you think about that. If you're a program that's working with non-traditional texts, or you're like a citizenship program, you may be able to pitch the question to USCIS or something for the citizenship. I'm just noticing a question in the chat, pardon me. Just a technology question. So, but yeah, if you all have other feedback about how you contextualized Best Plus when you were, or Best Literacy when you were just adopting it and figuring out your levels, that would be helpful for users. And you don't have to be a panelist. You can share that from any of your perspectives.
I think we're still figuring it out. It's been a wild year, of course, for everybody, but really figuring how students are placing into classes. We're using the Standout series. I think it's going to be a lot of reflection and a lot of looking at some data and looking at some trends and seeing if anything's going to pop out at us. I think Karen's done a really good job with the teachers and the curriculum, and really to understand how we look at the students' needs and move forward instructionally. But I think that we're going to find out some more information once we start to look at that. Karen focuses on the quality, and I'm the quantity person. I'm the data person. And so looking at that at this point, I think is going to provide some really great feedback for our fall-in services. So we can't really speak to it that much right now, other than it's a process and you need to look at many different aspects in order to figure it out. And there's going to be some trial and error in there for sure.
I remember at the Literacy Council when I was getting trained to use the Best Plus, we were just adopting it, and it did take some time. And we always remembered that Best Plus was just looking at the speaking and listening, so we needed to pair it with the other aspects that we were assessing, whether it was teacher judgments that had experience with a learner that was returning to class, or, you know, looking at the intake documents to see, like, okay, they have this speaking level, but do they have any literacy? Do they have help with filling out those forms? Things like that. All right. Feel free to post in the chat any other questions you have. This user just has a couple more, so either pop them in the chat or I'll refer to this one. Jordy asks, how well has the initial scoring and retest worked as far as logistics and effectiveness? I would love to pose that question to Selena for the context of in-person, and Elizabeth for the purpose, or in the context of remote, just because I know Elizabeth predominantly has experience with remote, if that's all right. Okay.
I'm not sure if I understand the question 100%, like logistics as in just how do you test?
I think that's what that means. How do you figure out when to test? What do you, like when you first integrate Best Plus, it's kind of like, when am I going to do this? So I think talking about
Gotcha.
What's your, if you were to describe a room and flow of people and things like that, I think that would be good.
Okay. I think for us, it's usually, you know, a lot of best testers are the first people that our students meet. So a lot of times it's just really right at the beginning of the trimester, they get tested. In the before times, they would be waiting in a room, or, oh no, I'm sorry, they'll be in their classrooms, actually. They'll be in their classrooms, and then they're pulled out one by one. Every site does things differently because we have sites all over the East Coast, but every site does things a little bit differently. But at least in the Manhattan site, they're all in class, and then the tester comes and pulls them out one by one, tests them, and then if they need to be placed in a different class, they'll be placed right away, depending on what time of day it is. If they're already kind of well in the middle of class, we just say, okay, go to this class next week. So that's kind of how we do it. But for example, for CAD, they do things a little bit differently. They have like a kind of like an intake, kind of like an orientation. That's what it is. It's an orientation, giving information about the training fund, and students get tested during this time, allotted for like an information session kind of thing. So every site does things differently, and we have less students here than, for example, in CAD, they have a bigger, larger class size. So for us, picking people from a class one by one makes sense, but for something bigger, having an orientation and kind of factoring that as part of the orientation, I think that makes sense.
So that was an idea of an in-person flow. So that initial class that the folks are in and then pulled out of it, is it basically like a multi-level class till we figure out where to put you?
Yep.
Got it.
That's basically what it is. Yeah.
Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to contrast with how it's worked for remote?
Sure. So we set up a system that we had an online intake form through Google Forms. And then once the student completed that, then they were directed to a Calendly link. And Calendly is a service that you can pair with a calendar that allows people to make appointments that are not previously or during a time slot, a prearranged time slot. And so we would schedule people at 45-minute intervals, really just to allow, because some of the testing can take up to 30 minutes. And then if there's any debrief or questions that we needed to have with students, so we wanted to make sure we had plenty of time. So we made 45-minute intervals. And then students would sign up for that, and then they would get all the reminders. But we would also, whoever the tester was for that day, would make sure students that were signed up for that that session would get a reminder call and or email. And these are all for intakes, obviously. And then post that, post the placement. At the time, that was the only test we were doing for placement. And so we would give them the course information and confirm all their information, their contact, and send them the class assignment form, and then invite them to come pick up the materials at a certain time. And then the first day of class, we'd have the teachers confirm that, well, the first week, not the first day, that was a little bit impossible to confirm anything, but the first week or so, have teachers, work with them, confirm that they're in the right level, and then we can make adjustments from that. And that actually worked out really well. We're looking at how to do that, because now for the fall, when we do a new intake, how we want to build in that orientation piece. And Selena, I think that like the part that you have them together at the beginning in a multi-level class, it doesn't really distinguish their levels, but it really speaks to the building community and connectedness of being a student in the classroom in this environment. And so we're looking at components of that to do the exact same thing, but then move into inviting them to an orientation session, which at other agencies we've called like a welcome class, and this may have lasted 1 or 2 days to get everybody in there, and then do testing for the formal testing for reading on CASAS, and then the placement after that fact. So we'll play a little bit and steal as much as we possibly can from people who are willing to share best practices. But we do the same thing. So, and when we monitor for progress testing, we do the same thing. We have a report that says who's eligible, and then I send out emails to them, and then they schedule through Calendly. And then that it's such a simple process, and it eliminates the program support person having to make 5 million phone calls and double booking and sending the wrong link. And so Calendly has been really lovely if you want to try it out, and it's free, which is great. So those are our logistics.
Do any other folks on the call want to share any other contrasting feedback about how logistically testing has worked in person or remotely? All right, so you both described it as sort of the intake point. Maybe a nice contrast would be to talk about how it works at post-testing. Same question, same folks. Selena for in-person. Well, I guess, yeah, Selena for in-person and Elizabeth for remote. Is that okay?
We don't really have a post. Just because we have students coming in. It's rolling admissions, so we have students coming in at different points in the trimester. So what we have decided is to test students once they complete 100+ hours of instruction, and it's more in an individual. We don't have like a set time for anybody. We just there's like an alarm that comes up when somebody reaches their 100+ hours, and we try to catch them when we can. We don't actually, this part is the part that I think, because of the remote classes, we've been much better at tackling, because before we'd have to go to all these different sites in person, and if there were just 1 or 2 people in, for example, Dover, New Jersey, it didn't make sense to send one person out there, and spend all that time traveling and all that. So yeah, with remote classes, actually one interesting thing that we've been doing is a lot of our in-person classes we've been testing remotely via phone. The teacher helps them connect with their phones, because there's some sites that don't have testers available nearby, or like the manager has just so many different the site managers have so many different locations that they can't get to everybody at all times. So what we've been kind of toying around with is, for example, Connecticut has a couple of places where they rent spaces in universities. So they use the computer lounge, and the teacher just brings them in the computer lounge, and somebody in New York City is, testing, best testing them. So we've been toying with that, like in person, but doing it remotely anyway, kind of thing. And that's been working really well.
For your size operation, that sounds like it would be a benefit to commuting cross interstate / cross New York City.
Yeah, I used to go to New Jersey all the time, or like up to Westchester County, and like travel all over the place just to test, because there weren't a lot of testers available, and especially like for a Saturday class, not a lot of people are available Saturdays. And so actually, one thing that we learned during this time is that we're going to keep doing remote testing in some of these sites, because it just works really well, and it just saves people time. Sorry, I kind of drifted away from the question.
Maybe I'll insert at this moment and contrast with my before times experience at the Literacy Council. We started with a sort of testing season model where it would be like we do pre-tests at intake, but then we would do all post-tests in like a certain 2-week period just before the end of classes. But then as hours restrictions started to be more firm in Virginia, we switched to a pull-out method because not all students were at the same track in their hours. So that mirrors much more of Selena's experience. But a note, because Selena works with a training fund for a union, they aren't beholden to the federal standards in the same way. So they're working independent of that. And that's why they're able to do the 100 hours plus. Elizabeth, do you want to talk about how post-testing has worked logistically? It sounds like it's not a preference for how it's worked so far, but love to hear it.
So yeah, no, the post testing hasn't been going so bad. Like I said earlier, we're required to post test at 40 hours, and we get notices from the state if we are not. Nice little nudges. But we really try to look around 60 as far as being able to measure reasonable gain, offering as many hours as we do a week. And so Selena, I'm a little bit jealous of you not having to. On the refugee program, we have a lot more flexibility, and so that's been nice too. So like I said, we just pull out the data, who's eligible, send out emails to students to have them set up an appointment, let them know and remind them that this is the speaking and listening test, no worries. Try to be really casual with it. You have 2 different tests. This is what the test for speaking and listening is, and then you'll be receiving a phone call for the cost of test to actually come in to complete that. So really trying to get them that, talking to teachers also about what it is and what it means, because they seem like one of them gets a test request, and then they go to class and they tell everyone, oh my gosh, we have to test again, and then everybody freaks out, and then the teacher. So trying to also make sure the teachers are in the know about it, as well as strategies for decreasing that anxiety. And as much as we as teachers try to say, it doesn't matter, it's a standardized test, let's move forward. It's not used to judge you as a person. They still obsess about it. And I only got 1 point gain, and I'm not, and so they're like, another one, oh, I didn't get any. And so they share that in class. And in the virtual world, everyone hears it now. So it's not like a little side conversation in the classroom. So that's been fun. But really working with the teachers to have them understand what the standardized assessment is, and how it's used, and how they can use it as a tool for instruction, but also for managing classroom expectations and growth over the period of learning. So that's been a huge part of what we've needed to do, and still are doing with some teachers who struggle with the fact that we have to do this. So, getting them as allies in this is kind of our goal. But the Calendly invite, there are some students that are incredibly responsive, and they're engaged, and they sign up immediately, and they understand kind of the process. And others, we have to kind of just really work with them. And in some cases, and particularly the lower levels, the beginning NRS 1, 2, 3, we would jump into the classroom, and we would bring in the cadre of testers at the same time. So we would have to disrupt instruction in the virtual environment as little as possible. So if we could get 3 or 4 people who are qualified testers to go into a beginning level class and there are 6 students there and 40 testing, we can pull them all out instead of doing it one by one. And so that's been really helpful to the teacher and the student to decrease disruption from the pullout, the virtual pullouts that we have to do to get the students post-tested.
So Elizabeth, you've already switched to Google Meet, or you are midstream?
We have just switched to Google Meet, and I think Karen has done 2 online, and I think I've done 2 as well. And it works fine. We had some issues with the instruction and sound and video and such, but that's not the issue. But neither one of us have had an issue with being able to share. I mean, the first time we did it, it was, it's not as quick, and I had things set up on my Zoom that I could just hit share and it would pop it up. And this, you kind of still have to go through the old fashioned, I want to share this and this is how I want to share it. And, just make sure you have that set up right in place. But we will be starting more in earnest with Google Meet and the testing here in the next week when the students that are ready for post-testing are coming in. So, but we haven't had any issues with, it's just being comfortable with where everything is.
I'll ask Remy to share our website in the chat that has some of the guiding questions folks can use if you have not considered online testing. And if you're like hearing it and you're like, why are people doing this if they don't have to? It's because folks are trying to meet students where they are and have as less impediment as possible to learning. So if they're able to meet online, you're meeting them online. So
they don't have to drive down for it, get childcare, like you said, Katie. It's
and I'm thinking Denver snow.
We don't. That's just a myth. We don't really have snow. For more than about 24 hours, it's fine.
Okay. But so sort of in this effort to meet students where they are, the website, I'll ask Remy to post, or actually it looks like it has some guiding questions that might help you choose your video conferencing software, because we as a test publisher have no preference, but you might want to think through what will be easy for you, what will be easy for the learners. With Google Meet, does it have breakout rooms?
It does. So that's something that is, to be competitive, I think that they ramp that up pretty quickly. There are some limitations to it. It's not as easy, I think, as Zoom, but it's not an impediment. The biggest challenge we have, we just went, Karen is probably sleeping on her desk right now because she's exhausted from the past 2 weeks. We were told we completed a grant proposal on May 20th, and May 21st, they're like, oh yeah, by the way, the district said, we're getting rid of Zoom and you have to transition to Google Meet. And we're like, you couldn't have done this, just, given us any notification on this. And so we had to transition everybody over.
Was that because the district was paying for it, or?
Yeah. And now, even to get into this meeting, we had to be like, no, we're not using Zoom. We're going to a meeting. So yeah, it's kind of silly, but so we've had to, and there's been some presentation issues, and Karen's been really looking at that and trying to iron those out. But the one thing that we have the biggest barrier with is if students don't have a Gmail. Have a Gmail and actually remember their passwords to access it, and because that is the biggest impediment that we're seeing right now.
I remember trying to set up a computer literacy tutoring program, and that being the first barrier. You're teaching them the anatomy of the computer and don't forget your password.
Yep. Oh, I have 5 emails. I know no password, but 5 emails.
So those are the sorts of questions you might want to think through if you're in the early phases of thinking about remote testing. I do want to flag, we've got 4 minutes left. I don't want to take any more time than that, but please post any other questions you have while we have these wonderful speakers here and your colleagueship. I'm seeing some familiar names that have tons of experience on the line. I see Danielle and Gretchen. So if you have other thoughts as well, and Penny, these are Best Plus trainers as well. But also no pressure. You are not you are not obliged to speak if you do not prefer to.
I have a question for everybody, actually. Has anybody tried to test using like WhatsApp video or like FaceTime, or, you know, because we sometimes struggle with digital literacy as well, like people who don't know how to manage a computer at all. And or even like phones, like how to download apps. So a lot of our members use WhatsApp anyway, so that's something very familiar. And I was wondering if I don't have experience using WhatsApp for testing purposes, but I was just wondering if anybody, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I see Deborah posting in the chat. Yep, we use WhatsApp and FaceTime all the time. And I just want to clarify, Deborah, is that for instruction, like regular class time, or testing as well? Testing. Yeah, so just to walk through, what does testing look like? In a scenario like this, it's ideal because Zoom has the ability to screen share. So when there's a picture queue, you can use the share option. But if you want to go low tech, you can always have two screens and present an image to the screen. It's not ideal, especially if there's a glare, but that's the main aspect. Penny notes, yes, we have, but I am HSE testing right now and can't talk. It seems to work well for testing because they're familiar with it. Yeah, when Remy and I were sort of piloting what are going to be the limitations of video conferencing, from our standpoint as a test publisher, the reason video conferencing versus, landline is that you need the identity verification with a person, and it helps create that sort of intimacy of a one-to-one conversation more so with a beginning learner or an English learner rather, and the picture cues. So the test is normed for not pandemic purposes. So it's normed for in-person, but the federal government has given approval for folks to be doing it remotely. And right now there's no expiration on that. So with that in mind, you can use any video conferencing platform, but just think through the logistics, as Elizabeth has run into with like having an email address or credentials to log in, or the digital literacy aspects, as Selena has highlighted, might be something that needs more setup than just arranging the appointment time to meet for testing. It might need some ongoing coaching to get them to that level, as you may have gotten them into classes.
Okay, thank you all so much. I'm reading the comments, and yeah, I'm gonna look into that, because I think some of our part of the reason why we do a lot of in-person testing is because of this, and we could maybe curb that a little bit and use WhatsApp and Viber, right? Okay, very nice. Thank you.
Yeah. I want to thank all the panelists for their time. I want to thank all of you attendees, and for folks that weren't able to log in that are looking forward to this video, please continue to send questions to us at aea@cal.org, and I will pop up that screen so that it's in the recording for you as well. But if you have any other further questions, don't be afraid to pop them in the chat. You might be wondering about virtual testing in general. You might be wondering about scoring, test activation, ordering, Best Literacy, we didn't really talk much about. You might be wondering about new products for Best Plus 3.0 or Best Literacy 2.0. We're happy to share information about that. But if you have further questions, you just reach out to us at aa@cal.org. We'll be right here. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.